Undaunted Courage, Meriwether Lewis, Thomas Jefferson, and the Opening of the American West by Stephen E. Ambrose. Picture yourself for a moment. You're standing on the muddy bank of a wide, fast-moving river, somewhere in what we now call South Dakota. You're 1,500 miles from the nearest town. Your co-commander, William Clark, has just gone ashore in a small canoe to meet with the local tribe, the Teton Sioux. You've been warned about them. They're proud, powerful, and they believe this river belongs to them. From the deck of your main boat, you watch the meeting unfold. At first, things seem cordial enough. But then, as Clark tries to return, the warriors grab the canoe's rope. One of the chiefs, called the Partisan, shoves Clark hard, gets right in his face, and declares that you will not be allowed to pass. He says he hasn't received enough presents. He demands a whole canoe full of your precious supplies before he lets you continue. On the shore, dozens of warriors string their bows. They reach for arrows in their quivers. You see Clark, your friend, outnumbered and surrounded. He draws his sword. And you give the order. Your men spring into action. They load the swivel cannon at the front of the boat, not with a cannonball, but with 16 musket balls, essentially a giant shotgun. They aim the smaller blunderbusses. They raise their rifles. You grab a burning taper, a slow-burning match, and you hold it right over the fuse of the main cannon. One word from you, just one word, and this tense standoff becomes a bloodbath. The history of the American West, maybe even the country itself, could change in that single, smoky, violent instant. What do? This was the moment that Captain Meriwether Lewis faced on September 25, 1804. His decision would test every ounce of his courage and leadership. And it's just one of 100 such moments in one of the greatest adventure stories ever told. Today, we're journeying into the heart of that story with Stephen E. Ambrose's masterpiece, Undaunted Courage. This isn't just some dry history lesson. It's a profound look into the soul of a young nation and the character of the man chosen to explore its uncharted heart. It became a #1 bestseller, a book that single-handedly placed the names Lewis and Clark back into the center of the American story. Ambrose was a master historian, a man who dedicated his life to telling the stories of American heroes, from the soldiers of D-Day and the Band of Brothers to presidents like Eisenhower. But in Meriwether Lewis, he found a different kind of hero, a brilliant, brave, and deeply troubled man on a mission that would define his life, and in many ways his country. By the end of our journey today, you'll understand not just what Lewis and Clark did, but why it mattered. You'll discover the secret to their leadership, the nature of true courage, and how a vision held by one man, President Thomas Jefferson, and executed by another, Captain Meriwether Lewis, literally changed the map of the world. To understand the Great Expedition, you first have to understand the two men who imagined it. One was a president, a philosopher, and a dreamer. The other was a young soldier, a skilled woodsman, and a soul searching for a grand purpose. The story begins not on the wild frontier, but in the refined world of Virginia, with Thomas Jefferson. Long before he was president, Jefferson was obsessed with the West. He looked at a map of North America and saw not just a collection of colonies on the East Coast, but a continental nation, an empire of liberty, stretching from sea to shining sea. To him, the great mysterious lands beyond the Mississippi River were the future. The burning question was, could a single water route, a kind of Northwest Passage, connect the Atlantic to the Pacific? The nation that found it would control the destiny of the continent. But this was just a dream, until a young man from his own neighborhood entered his life. His name was Meriwether Lewis. Lewis was born on the edge of the wilderness in 1774. From his bedroom window, He could see the Blue Ridge Mountains, an open invitation to the unknown West. He grew up with the skills of the frontier. As a boy of just 8 years old, he would venture out alone at night with his dogs to hunt raccoons and opossums, even in the freezing snow. He was cool-headed and courageous, but he was also a gentleman's son, heir to a plantation, and a member of one of Virginia's most distinguished families. This gave him a unique combination, the toughness of the frontier and the intellectual curiosity of the Enlightenment. His father died when he was a boy, leaving a painful void in his life, but his mother Lucy was a remarkable woman. She was a renowned herbalist, teaching young Meriwether everything she knew about the medicinal properties of wild plants, a skill that would later save lives on the expedition. He was restless, filled with what he called a, quote, quixotic disposition for rambling. He joined the army, not just for adventure, but to find a purpose. It was there, in the military, that he crossed paths with the man who would become his partner in history, a quiet, steady, red-headed captain named William Clark. They served together for only 6 months, but in that time, they formed a bond of complete and total trust. Jefferson, now president, saw something special in Lewis. He saw a man with courage undaunted, a deep familiarity with the wilderness, and a sharp, observant mind. In 1801, he made a fateful decision. He invited the 27-year-old Captain Lewis to Washington to become his personal secretary. For 2 years, Lewis lived in the president's house with Jefferson. It was an apprenticeship like no other. Every day, he was at the side of one of the most brilliant minds of the age. Jefferson became the father figure Lewis never had. He tutored Lewis in botany, astronomy, geography, and ethnology. Lewis devoured the books in Jefferson's library, the world's most extensive collection on North America. He was being groomed for a mission, though its final form was not yet clear. Then, in 1803, everything changed. On July 4th, the nation's 27th birthday, Jefferson announced that the United States had purchased the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon. In a single stroke, the country had doubled in size. It was, as Ambrose calls it, the best land bargain ever made. Suddenly, Jefferson's dream expedition was no longer just a scientific venture into foreign territory. It was a military reconnaissance of America's own backyard. The very next day, July 5, 1803, Lewis set off. Jefferson gave him an extraordinary letter of credit, pledging the full faith of the United States government for any supplies he might need, anywhere in the world. The mission was on. Lewis's first stop was Philadelphia, the scientific capital of America. Jefferson arranged for him to take a crash course with the nation's top experts. He learned how to make celestial observations to calculate latitude and longitude, how to identify and preserve plant specimens, and how to classify fossils. He also went on a shopping spree, gathering everything a small army would need to disappear into the wilderness for years: rifles, powder, portable soup, medical supplies, including Dr. Rush's infamous purgative pills, known as thunderclappers, and most importantly, gifts for the native tribes he would encounter. But Lewis knew he couldn't do this alone. As he prepared, he wrote a letter to his old army friend William Clark, inviting him to be his co-commander. "There is no man on earth," Lewis wrote, "with whom I should feel equal pleasure in sharing the fatigues, the dangers, and the honors as with yourself." Clark, living a quiet life in Indiana, didn't hesitate. "I will cheerfully join you," he replied. "My friend, I join you with hand and heart." The partnership was sealed. It was a brilliant choice. Lewis was the philosopher, the scientist, the introspective and, sometimes moody leader. Clark was the pragmatist, the master waterman, the mapmaker, and the steady hand. They were a perfect team. In the fall of 1803, they met near Louisville, Kentucky, and began recruiting the first members of what would become the Corps of Discovery. They weren't looking for just any soldiers. They needed stout, healthy, unmarried men who were accustomed to the woods and capable of bearing bodily fatigue in a pretty considerable degree. They found them in the frontier posts, tough, hardy young men eager for adventure. They spent the winter of 1803 to 1804 at Camp Dubois, across from the mouth of the Missouri River. Here, Clark drilled the men into a disciplined unit while Lewis was in St. Louis, gathering supplies and, just as importantly, intelligence. He spoke with every French fur trader he could find, gathering information about the great river and the tribes who lived along it. He was creating a map in his mind before he ever took the first step. Finally, on May 14, 1804, the journey began. Clark and the men pushed their 55-foot keelboat and two smaller pirogues into the powerful, muddy current of the Missouri River. A week later, Lewis joined them, and the expedition was truly underway. The first leg of the journey was a brutal, muscle-straining ordeal. Moving the heavy keelboat against the Missouri's relentless current was backbreaking work. The men rowed, pulled, and often jumped into the water to pull the boat with ropes, sometimes making only a few miles a day. They were plagued by boils, dysentery, and swarms of mosquitoes, so thick they could hardly breathe. Discipline was harsh. When one private was caught stealing whiskey, he was sentenced to 100 lashes on his bare back. But there was also joy. On July 4th, they celebrated by firing their swivel cannon and issuing an extra gill of whiskey to each man. As Clark wrote, they were in a paradise of game, deer to be seen in every direction, surrounded by the most delicious fruit. In early August, they held their first council with Native Americans, the Otos and Missouris. Lewis delivered the speech he would give to dozens of tribes. He announced that their old French and Spanish fathers were gone, and they now had a new father in Washington, President Jefferson. He promised them peace and trade, but also warned them of the power of the United States, a power that could consume you as the fire consumes the grass of the plains. But the real test came in late September, when they reached the territory of the powerful Teton Sioux. This was the moment we started with. The Sioux saw themselves as the masters of the river, and they expected a toll from anyone who passed. The partisan demanded more gifts. Clark refused. For a tense few minutes, it seemed a battle was inevitable. But just as Lewis held the burning taper over the cannon, another chief, Black Buffalo, intervened, grabbing the tow line from his own warriors and ordering them to stand down. Bloodshed was avoided, but just barely. The encounter was a stark lesson. Their diplomacy, their promises of trade, and their military might would not always be enough. They would have to navigate the complex politics of the river with immense care and, sometimes, sheer luck. As the weather turned cold, they pushed on, reaching the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes in what is now North Dakota. Here, nearly 1,600 miles from St. Louis, they would build a fort and spend the winter. Fort Mandan became their home from November 1804 to April 1805. It was a crucial time of rest, repair, and learning. The Mandans were friendly and welcoming. The men of the Corps enjoyed the hospitality of the villages, especially from the women. Lewis and Clark, meanwhile, spent their days gathering intelligence. They learned from the Mandans about the river ahead, about the Great Falls, and about the Rocky Mountains. And it was here they met three people who would change the course of the expedition: a French-Canadian trader named Toussaint Charbonneau, his young Shoshone wife, Sacagawea, and their newborn son, Jean-Baptiste. The captains hired Charbonneau as an interpreter, but it was Sacagawea who was the real prize. She was from the Shoshone tribe, who lived in the heart of the mountains. Lewis knew he would need to get horses from her people to cross the Continental Divide. Sacagawea was their only link to them. She was, as Ambrose says, the expedition's great piece of good luck. On April 7, 1805, the expedition divided. The big keelboat, with a small crew, turned back downstream, carrying reports, maps, and precious specimens for President Jefferson. The permanent party, 33 people, including Sacagawea and her baby, pushed on into the unknown, in 2 pirogues and 6 smaller canoes. This little fleet, Lewis wrote in his journal that night, we were now about to penetrate a country at least 2,000 miles in width, on which the foot of civilized man had never trodden. What followed was a journey into a landscape of unimaginable beauty and danger. They entered a hunter's paradise, a land teeming with buffalo, elk, and antelope, so gentle that we passed near them while feeding, without appearing to excite any alarm. Lewis, his scientific curiosity on fire, was in his element, describing dozens of plants and animals new to science. But this garden had its monsters. On April 29th, they encountered their first grizzly bear. Lewis was initially confident, believing that, in the hands of skillful riflemen, they are by no means as formidable or dangerous. He quickly learned how wrong he was. A few days later, Clark and another man shot a grizzly 5 times through the lungs. The bear roared, swam halfway across the river, and took 20 minutes to die. A week after that, a hunting party of 6 men shot another grizzly 4 times. It charged them, chasing them for 80 yards. They shot it again, and again. It took 8 balls to bring it down. These encounters, Lewis admitted, rather astonished us all. His cockiness was gone, replaced by a deep and healthy respect. In late May, they reached a critical juncture. A large river flowed into the Missouri from the north, which was the true Missouri. The men were almost unanimous. The North Fork, which was muddy and turbulent just like the Missouri they knew. But Lewis and Clark disagreed. The South Fork ran clearer and had a rocky bottom, signs that it came from the mountains. This was the most important decision of the expedition. A wrong choice would cost them the entire season, and perhaps doom the mission. They decided to divide the party and explore. Clark went up the South Fork, Lewis up the north, which he named the Marias River. Lewis's exploration was a nightmare of flash floods and treacherous cliffs. At one point he slipped and nearly plunged 90 feet to his death, saving himself only by driving his espontoon, a short spear, into the crumbling bluff. Moments later, one of his men slipped and was left dangling over the precipice. Lewis, his own nerves shattered, calmly talked him back to safety. When they regrouped, Lewis and Clark were certain the South Fork was the way. The men, despite their doubts, agreed to follow. They were ready to follow us anywhere we thought proper to direct, Lewis wrote, a testament to the trust they had built. Lewis, now convinced he was on the right path, pushed ahead on foot. On June 13th, he heard it, a sound like distant thunder. He hurried on and saw the spray arise above the plain like a column of smoke. He had found the great falls of the Missouri. He was overwhelmed, writing that he was disgusted with his own imperfect description, wishing he had the pen of a great poet to capture the sublime grandeur of a sight which has, from the commencement of time, been concealed from the view of civilized man. His joy turned to dismay when he discovered that it wasn't one waterfall, but a series of 5, stretching over 10 miles. The portage would be much harder than they'd imagined. The men spent nearly a month hauling their heavy canoes and baggage over 18 miles of rough terrain, their feet shredded by prickly pear cactus, battered by hailstorms, and tormented by grizzly bears. Finally, on July 15th, they were back on the water, paddling toward the mountains. The river grew shallower, faster, and more crooked. The men were exhausted. They were nearing a breaking point. Everything now depended on finding the Shoshone Indians and their horses. On August 8th, Sacagawea gave them a surge of hope. She recognized a landmark, the Beaver's Head Rock. She told them this was the river of her people. They were close. Lewis, feeling the urgency, decided to go on ahead with a small party. On August 11th, he spotted a lone Indian on horseback. Lewis was overjoyed. He laid down his rifle, held up a flag, and walked forward, shouting the only Shoshone word he knew, "Tabbabone," white man. The warrior watched him, hesitant. Then, spooked by Lewis's men advancing on the flanks, he whipped his horse and vanished into the willows. With him, Lewis wrote, "Vanished all my hopes." But Lewis pushed on. The next day, his small party crested a ridge. They had reached the Continental Divide. Lewis stood on the backbone of the continent. "I had accomplished one of those great objects on which my mind has been unalterably fixed for many years," he wrote. He stooped down and drank from a spring, the very source of the mighty Missouri. Then, just a short walk over the pass, he found another spring, its waters flowing west. He drank again. For the first time he had tasted the waters of the great Columbia River. The next day, he found them. A band of 60 Shoshone warriors came charging at him. For a moment it looked like a battle was imminent, but Lewis, holding up his flag, kept his nerve. The chief, a man named Kameawait, dismounted and embraced him. Contact was made. Lewis began to negotiate for horses. And then, the miracle they had hoped for happened. Clark and the main party arrived. Sacagawea began to translate. As she looked at the chief, she suddenly recognized him. Kameawait was her brother. It was a scene of incredible emotion. Through her tears, Sacagawea helped secure the horses that would get the expedition across the next, and most difficult, barrier, the Bitterroot Mountains. What followed was the worst ordeal of the entire journey. They had a guide, an old man named Toby, but he led them into a nightmare. The Lolo Trail was a high, narrow path through a confusing maze of snow-covered peaks. They were hit by a blizzard in mid-September. The trail disappeared under feet of snow. Their food ran out. They were forced to kill and eat their own colts. The men grew weak, sick, and despondent. "I have been wet and as cold in every part as I ever was in my life," Clark wrote. Facing starvation, the captains made a desperate decision. Clark would take a small, fast-moving party ahead to find food. On September 22nd, after 11 days in the mountains, Clark's starving party stumbled out of the wilderness and onto the plains of modern-day Idaho, where they were found by the Nez Perce tribe. The Nez Perce, who could have easily killed the weak and helpless white men, instead welcomed them, fed them, and saved them from starvation. A few days later, Lewis and the rest of the party staggered in, much fatigued and hungry. The entire corps had been saved by the kindness of strangers. They rested with the Nez Perce for 2 weeks, building new dugout canoes. Then, on October 7th, they pushed their canoes into the Clearwater River and began the final rush to the sea. Now, for the first time, gravity was their friend. They sped down the Clearwater, to the Snake, and then to the mighty Columbia, running dangerous rapids that terrified their Indian guides. On November 7, 1805, after a year and a half of relentless travel, through a thick fog, Clark heard a new sound, the roar of breakers. He grabbed his pen. "Ocean in view," he scribbled in his journal. Oh, the joy! They had made it. They had crossed the continent. They spent a miserable, rain-soaked winter at a small fort they built near the coast, which they named Fort Clatsop. They were constantly wet, their food was rotting, and they were plagued by fleas. But they endured. Lewis spent the winter writing, filling his journals with detailed descriptions of the plants, animals, and native cultures of the Pacific coast. Clark created his masterpiece, a map that, for the first time, accurately depicted the American West, from the Mississippi to the Pacific. On March 23, 1806, they turned for home. The journey back was in some ways even more daring than the journey out. When they reached the Bitterroot Mountains, they decided to split the party into as many as 5 separate groups to explore more of the territory. Clark would head down the Yellowstone River. Lewis would take a more dangerous route, a shortcut to the Great Falls, and then an exploration of the Marias River, deep in the territory of the fearsome Blackfeet tribe. It was a huge risk, and for Lewis it almost proved fatal. On July 26th, his small party of 4 men ran into a group of 8 young Blackfeet warriors. They camped together, but the mood was tense. At dawn, the Blackfeet tried to steal their rifles. A fight broke out. One of the Field brothers stabbed and killed a warrior. Lewis, chasing another warrior who was trying to steal his horse, was fired upon, and he shot back, possibly wounding the man. 2 Blackfeet were dead. Lewis and his men grabbed their horses and fled, riding over 100 miles in a single day, not stopping until they reached the safety of the Missouri River. It was the only violent encounter of the entire expedition, a tragic end to what Lewis had hoped would be a mission of peace. A few weeks later, another near disaster. While hunting, Lewis was accidentally shot in the buttocks by one of his own men, the one-eyed fiddler, Pierre Cruzat, who mistook him for an elk. The wound was painful but not fatal. Lying on his stomach in a pirogue, Lewis was carried down the Missouri. On August 12th, the parties were reunited. From there it was a race home. They sped down the Missouri, stopping only briefly at the Mandan villages to drop off Sacagawea and her family. And then, on September 23, 1806, after 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days, the Corps of Discovery paddled into St. Louis. The townspeople, who had long given them up for dead, rushed to the riverbank to greet them, cheering the return of these men who looked, as one observer said, like Robinson Crusoes. They had returned. They had done the impossible. Meriwether Lewis immediately grabbed a pen and began his report to the man who had sent him, President Thomas Jefferson. His darling project was complete. So what do we take from this incredible story? It's more than just an adventure tale filled with grizzly bears and treacherous mountains. Undaunted Courage offers some of the most profound lessons on leadership, purpose, and the very nature of the human spirit. First, it's a story about the power of mentorship. Meriwether Lewis was brave and talented, but he was also young, a bit reckless, and searching. It was Thomas Jefferson who saw his potential and gave him a mission that was worthy of his talents. Jefferson didn't just give Lewis orders. He gave him an education. He sharpened his mind, expanded his vision, and entrusted him with a responsibility that transformed him. It's a powerful reminder for anyone, at any age. Find your Jefferson. Seek out someone who believes in you, who challenges you, and who gives you a map to a bigger world than the one you currently see. Second, the book is a masterclass in leadership, particularly in the partnership between Lewis and Clark. They were opposites who became a perfect whole. Lewis, the brilliant, but sometimes moody visionary. Clark, the steady, pragmatic anchor. They respected each other's strengths and compensated for each other's weaknesses. Most importantly, they never let ego get in the way. When the Army sent Clark a lieutenant's commission, instead of the captain's rank Lewis had promised, Lewis was mortified. He could have pulled rank and become the sole commander. Instead, he told Clark to hide the commission and swore that his pay and authority would be equal to his own. For the rest of the journey, to the men, they were always the captains. That act of loyalty and respect is the foundation on which their entire success was built. True leadership isn't about titles. It's about shared trust and mutual respect. And finally, there's the idea of courage itself. The title, Undaunted Courage, is perfect. The courage shown by the Corps was not the absence of fear. They were terrified when a grizzly bear charged them. They were disheartened and cold when they were starving in the Bitterroots, and their hearts pounded when they faced the Teton Sioux. Their courage came from their ability to act despite their fear. It came from their unwavering commitment to the mission and to each other. Lewis's own courage was immense, but it was also complex. He was brave enough to face down a charging grizzly, yet he battled inner demons of depression that ultimately proved more formidable than any external enemy. His tragic death by suicide just 3 years after his triumphant return reminds us that the most difficult wilderness to navigate is often the one within our own minds. His life is a testament to the fact that you can achieve world-changing greatness and still struggle with profound personal pain. So, what can we do with this today? First, start your own journal. The single greatest legacy of the expedition is the detailed record they kept. They understood that an experience unrecorded is a lesson lost. You don't have to cross a continent. Just start writing down your own journey, your thoughts, your struggles, your small victories. It will become the most valuable book you ever own. Second, take on your own Marias River. Find that one thing you need to know, that one question you need to answer for yourself, and go explore it, even if it feels daunting. The journey will teach you more than the destination. That was a summary of Undaunted Courage by Stephen E. Ambrose. We've explored the grand sweep of the journey today, but I have to be honest with you. A summary is like looking at a map of a great mountain range. It can show you the peaks and the valleys, but it can never let you feel the cold wind on your face or the sense of awe you get from standing on the summit. The real magic of this book is in the details, in Lewis's poetic descriptions of a landscape no American had ever seen, in the daily struggles and triumphs of the men, and in the quiet moments of reflection that reveal the heart of a true leader. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity, I urge you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just learning about history. It's an experience that will leave you with a deeper appreciation for what humans are capable of when they are pushed to their absolute limits. There's a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please take a moment to subscribe and perhaps share it with someone who loves a great story. It helps us continue our mission of exploring the world's most powerful books. Let's keep learning and growing together.